Imagine the bitter chill of a Virginia winter seeping through your threadbare clothes, biting into flesh that hasn't seen a warm fire in months. You are surrounded by the hacking, wet coughs of walking corpses. Men who used to be soldiers, now reduced to shivering skeletons in the pitch-black dark. There is no glass in the windows, only heavy iron bars that let the freezing wind howl through the brick corridors like a choir of the damned. If you step just an inch too close to those bars, seeking even a sliver of moonlight, a rifle will crack in the night. The bullet will tear through your skull before your body even hits the wooden floor. You are buried alive in a 3-story brick tomb overlooking the James River. There is no trial, no release date, and for most, no way out except in a pine box. Welcome to Libby Prison, the deepest circle of hell in the American Civil War. If you're listening to this late at night and feeling those chills down your spine, do me a favor. Smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which part scared you the most. Your support helps me keep digging into these dark, forgotten corners of history. The year is 1864. The nation is actively tearing itself to bloody shreds. Richmond, Virginia, stands as the proud, heavily fortified capital of the Confederacy. It is a city on edge, paranoid, and strictly locked down. The streets are swarming with rebel troops, local militia, and the ever-present stench of desperation. But towering over the southeastern edge of the city, right on the muddy, freezing banks of the James River, sits a massive, looming brick structure that casts a dark shadow over the cobblestones. Before the country broke out into total war, this building was nothing but a mundane, everyday warehouse. The faded white letters painted on the side of its weathered brick exterior still read, "Libby & Son, Ship Chandlers and Grocers." It used to hold tobacco, farming tools, and basic ship supplies. Now, it holds human souls. The Confederacy stripped the massive building bare, transforming its 3 cavernous floors into a maximum security holding pen exclusively for captured Union officers. By the brutal winter of 1864, over 1,000 Northern commanders, captains, and lieutenants are packed into its freezing, uninsulated rooms like livestock waiting for the slaughter. They are effectively on death row, waiting for disease or starvation to finally pull the lever. Survival inside Libby is a daily, agonizing lottery. The Confederate guards, suffering from severe supply shortages themselves, offer the prisoners barely enough food to keep their hearts beating. The daily ration is a pathetic, crumbling sliver of cornbread, often baked with the tough husks still in it, and maybe a tiny spoonful of rancid, rotting meat crawling with maggots. Scurvy, dysentery, and starvation are the real wardens here. Men waste away in front of each other's eyes. Their teeth fall out, their gums bleed constantly, and their skin stretches so tight over their ribs that they look like they belong on a coroner's slab rather than a military cell block. The floorboards are slick with the filth and fluids of hundreds of sick and dying men. And then there is the cold. The windows of Libby Prison have absolutely no glass. It is just open air, barred with heavy iron grates. During the brutal winter storms of early 1864, the freezing winds sweep straight off the James River, bringing blinding snow and sharp ice directly into the crowded cell blocks. Men huddle together in massive, shivering piles at night, trying to share what little body heat they have left, praying silently that they don't wake up next to a stiff, frozen corpse. The man orchestrating this misery is Confederate Major Thomas P. Turner. He is a cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient commandant who runs Libby with an iron fist. Turner looks at the captured Union officers not as prisoners of war, but as dangerous vermin that need to be contained at all costs. He proudly boasts to his superiors that Libby Prison is an impenetrable fortress. It is heavily guarded, surrounded by open streets, and crawling with heavily armed sentries whose orders are crystal clear. Nobody gets out alive. Turner has instituted a psychological reign of terror to keep his inmates in line. But his most infamous, blood-curdling rule is the deadline. It isn't a yellow line painted on the floor. It is an invisible, lethal boundary near the unglazed windows. If a prisoner gets too close to the iron bars to catch a desperate breath of fresh air, or even accidentally brushes a hand against the cold iron to look out at the river below, the guards posted on the street are ordered to shoot on sight. No warnings, no shouts to back away, just the deafening, echoing crack of a musket, a puff of gray smoke, and a man dropping dead onto the blood-stained wood. It happens with terrifying frequency. The guards below take a sick, twisted pride in their marksmanship, treating the trapped officers like target practice. Escaping Libby is widely considered absolute suicide. It's an impossible odds scenario that would make even the most hardened escape artist physically sick. Even if, by some sheer miracle, a prisoner manages to slip past the armed guards patrolling every single floor, make it out the heavy iron doors, and evade the snipers stationed on the street, where would they go? They are deep inside the dark heart of the Confederacy. Richmond is the most heavily militarized city in the South. The closest Union lines are dozens of miles away, across treacherous, freezing swamps, and hostile territory swarming with cavalry patrols and bloodthirsty tracking hounds. The prisoners know this all too well. They are locked down, beaten down, and slowly rotting away in the dark. The psychological toll of waiting for death to claim them is pushing men to the absolute brink of insanity. The air inside Libby is thick with heavy despair, the metallic scent of dried blood, and the sour reek of unwashed bodies. They are trapped in a 3-story brick coffin. But as the winter wind howls fiercely through the iron bars, and another gunshot echoes into the black night, a silent, desperate resolve begins to take root in the shadows. If they stay inside Libby Prison, they are already dead men. The only way to survive is to do the impossible, to pull off a miracle. The only way out is down. In any maximum security lockup, there are 2 types of inmates. The first type slowly accepts their fate, letting the walls crush their spirit until they fade away into the concrete. The second type never stops looking for the exit. Colonel Thomas E. Rose, a battle-hardened commander from the 77th Pennsylvania Infantry, was undeniably the latter. Captured in the bloody chaos of the Battle of Chickamauga, Rose was dragged into Libby Prison to rot alongside his fellow Union brass. But while other men were coughing up blood and praying for a swift death, Rose's mind was running a mile a minute. He wasn't just sitting in his cell waiting for the Grim Reaper. He had tunnel vision. He was quietly, methodically sizing up his cage. Rose possessed a cold, analytical set of eyes. He watched the guards. He timed their patrols. He noted exactly how long it took for the sentries on the street to walk from one corner of the brick fortress to the other. But a mastermind needs a second in command, a partner in crime to bounce crazy ideas off of. Enter Major A.G. Hamilton of the 12th Kentucky Cavalry. Hamilton was a man cut from the exact same gritty cloth as Rose. Smart, fiercely determined, and absolutely desperate to break out of this 3-story slaughterhouse. Together, these two men became the silent architects of what would soon be the most impossible prison break in American history. Now, they weren't the first guys to try and beat the system at Libby. Desperate men had already tried to slip through the cracks. Some tried to bribe the half-starved rebel guards, only to get a rifle butt to the teeth and a trip to solitary confinement. Others tried to disguise themselves as visiting doctors, attempting to just walk right out the front door in a brazen daytime escape. Every single one of them failed. They were either caught, brutally beaten, or shot dead on the spot. Commandant Turner had the place locked down tight. Security was an absolute nightmare. An airtight grid of armed sentries, strict roll calls, and locked doors. The rebels knew they had the high-value targets, and they weren't about to let a single one slip through their fingers. Rose and Hamilton realized very quickly that a traditional breakout was a suicide mission. Going out the windows meant catching a sniper's bullet. Sneaking out the front gates meant fighting an entire garrison of heavily armed Confederate troops. Going up to the roof was a dead end. There was only one direction left to go: down. Like phantom surveyors, the two officers began mentally mapping the entire layout of Libby Prison. They paced the rotting wooden floorboards day after day, secretly counting their steps, calculating the exact thickness of the walls, and visualizing the building's foundation. They needed a blind spot, a glitch in the matrix. After weeks of silent observation, they finally found it. On the ground floor of the prison was a heavily guarded kitchen area used by the inmates during the day to boil their pathetic rations of rancid meat. Inside this kitchen sat a massive, abandoned brick fireplace. It was a vital piece of the puzzle, but there was a massive problem. They couldn't just start digging a tunnel right there in the kitchen. The floor was solid brick, and guards constantly patrolled the area. If a guard walked in and caught them clawing at the floorboards, they would be hanging from a rope before sunrise. To pull off a subterranean escape, they needed a staging area, a place hidden from the prying eyes of the guards, where they could slowly and meticulously tunnel out without drawing heat. They looked at their mental map. Directly beneath that kitchen fireplace, sitting below ground level, was the building's basement. But this wasn't just any basement. The cellar of Libby Prison was a dark, foul, and terrifying abyss. Originally used to store heavy goods before the war, the Confederacy had completely abandoned it. Why? Because the eastern half of the cellar was essentially a massive open sewer. It was a subterranean nightmare filled with 2 feet of stagnant, freezing water, rotting garbage, human waste, and decaying straw. The stench alone was enough to make a grown man violently vomit. The air down there was thick, toxic, and barely breathable. Worse than the smell, though, were the inhabitants. The cellar was infested with thousands of massive, starving, vicious black rats. They swarmed over the garbage in undulating, squeaking waves. They were so aggressive and so numerous that the Confederate guards flat out refused to set foot down there. They locked the heavy basement doors, sealed it off, and left it to the vermin. The Union prisoners, terrified of the horrific noises echoing from below the floorboards at night, had given it a chilling nickname: Rat Hell. For any sane human being, Rat Hell was a place to be avoided at all costs. It was a dark, disease-ridden tomb that promised a slow, agonizing death. But as Colonel Rose and Major Hamilton stared down at the kitchen floor, they realized the terrifying truth. The very thing that made Rat Hell so horrifying was exactly what made it their only ticket to freedom. Because the guards were absolutely terrified of the basement, it was the only place in the entire maximum security compound that was completely unmonitored. It was the ultimate blind spot. If they could somehow break through the solid brick floor of the kitchen fireplace, slip down into the pitch-black, rat-infested swamp without getting caught, and survive the suffocating, toxic atmosphere, they would have a hidden base of operations. From deep inside rat hell, they could launch an underground assault on the prison's foundation, clawing their way through the earth and under the heavily guarded streets of Richmond. The plan was absolute madness. It required them to descend into a literal underworld, a pitch-black nightmare where one wrong move meant being buried alive in raw sewage. But for men on death row, madness is just another word for hope. The architects of despair had found their blueprint. Now, all they had to do was break into hell. Breaking into rat hell was an extremely high-stakes game of cat and mouse. The kitchen area was heavily trafficked during the day, so Colonel Rose and Major Hamilton had to make their move under the cover of utter darkness, operating in a terrifying window of opportunity when the guards' patrols were at their lightest. Every single sound echoed in the cavernous brick building. A dropped tool, a scraped brick, or a sudden sneeze meant instant execution. They were operating right under the noses of the feds, well, the rebel equivalent of them, and the tension was suffocating. Their target was the massive, abandoned brick fireplace sitting silently in the kitchen. To get into the basement, they had to remove the bricks from the back of the hearth, creating a hole just large enough for a grown, starving man to squeeze through. But they couldn't just smash the wall. If a guard walked past and saw a gaping hole in the fireplace, the entire prison would be locked down and torn apart. They had to be surgical. Using nothing but a stolen, rusted pocket knife and a crude, jagged chisel they had managed to secretly fashion from a piece of scrap iron, the two officers began the agonizing process of digging out the heavy, dried mortar between the bricks. They worked in absolute silence, communicating only through soft taps and hand gestures in the dark. It was maddeningly slow work. They could only chip away at a few inches of mortar every night, constantly pausing to listen for the heavy, rhythmic thud of a Confederate sentry's boots pacing the floorboards just feet away. The anxiety was a physical weight on their chests. At any moment, the kitchen door could swing open, exposing their desperate midnight sabotage. But the most nerve-wracking part wasn't the digging, it was the cleanup. Every single morning, long before the sun rose and the 5 a.m. roll call began, Rose and Hamilton had to carefully place every brick back into the fireplace wall. They meticulously swept away the dust and scraped mortar, hiding the evidence. They then disguised the seams with soot and ashes, making the fireplace look completely undisturbed. It was a terrifying daily routine. One brick placed slightly askew, one speck of fresh mortar left on the floor, and their lives were over. After several grueling nights of chipping and hiding, they finally loosened enough bricks to create a small, dark opening. It was time. Taking a deep breath of the cold, stale prison air, Colonel Rose grabbed a rope they had secretly braided from torn blankets and lowered himself, feet first, into the black void. The descent into rat hell was an experience straight out of a horror movie. As Rose slid down into the pitch black, the temperature plummeted, and a foul, suffocating odor rushed up to meet him. It was the smell of rotting organic matter, stagnant water, and raw human waste. It was the scent of a mass grave. When his boots finally touched the squishy, unseen floor below, the true horror of the basement revealed itself. The darkness was absolute, thick and disorienting. But as Rose's eyes struggled to adjust, the sounds began. A high-pitched, chattering squeak echoed from the shadows. Then another, and another. Suddenly, the entire floor around him seemed to move. Hundreds, thousands of massive black rats swarmed over his boots. They brushed against his legs, their sharp little claws clicking against the wet stones. These weren't normal rats. They were starving, aggressive vermin that had been feeding on the refuse of 1,000 dying men. The psychological terror of standing in knee-deep sludge while hundreds of hungry rats crawled over you would break most men. But Rose couldn't scream. He couldn't make a sound. The guards were pacing directly above his head. He had to stand perfectly still in the dark, letting the rats gnaw at his boots, and wait for Hamilton to slide down behind him. Once they were both trapped in the putrid blackness of rat hell, the real work began. They had successfully infiltrated the basement, but they were still heavily locked inside the prison's footprint. Their next target was the massive eastern foundation wall of Libby Prison. It was a formidable barrier of solid stone and thick brick, built to hold up the massive 3-story structure. Beyond that wall lay the dense earth beneath Carey Street, heavily patrolled by Confederate sentries whose boots literally pounded the pavement above. Operating in total darkness, relying only on touch and sheer willpower, Rose and Hamilton felt their way through the rat-infested swamp until they reached the cold, damp foundation wall. They had to punch a hole straight through it. The physical toll was unimaginable. Breathing the toxic, methane-heavy air in the basement made their heads spin and their lungs burn. They worked for hours in the freezing muck, using their primitive chisel to slowly, painfully pry the massive stones apart. They were literally dismantling a prison fortress from the inside out, inch by agonizing inch. The sound of their scraping tools had to be perfectly timed with the footsteps of the guards outside. The tension was constant and completely draining. Every night they dropped down into the abyss. Every night they fought off the rats. Every night they chipped away at the wall, hiding the rubble under the piles of trash and straw that littered the basement floor. It took weeks of secret, back-breaking labor in the foulest conditions imaginable. But finally, the heavy stones gave way. They removed the last block, exposing a dark, raw face of solid Virginia clay. They had breached the perimeter wall. They were no longer inside Libby Prison. They were staring at the raw earth directly beneath the feet of the Confederate guards. The stage was set. The blind spot was secured. It was time to start clawing their way to freedom. Punching through the foundation wall was a massive victory, but Colonel Rose knew that 2 men alone couldn't pull off an engineering miracle. They needed muscle, stamina, and absolute, unbreakable trust. They needed a crew. Rose carefully and quietly began recruiting a secret digging team, selecting 13 other Union officers who were strong enough to work, sane enough not to crack under the insane pressure, and, most importantly, capable of keeping their mouths completely shut. They swore an oath of absolute silence. If anyone breathed a word of the tunnel to the general prison population, panic would spread. The guards would find out, and the digging crew would swing from the gallows. The logistics of the dig were a nightmare. They had no shovels, no picks, no wheelbarrows. They were attempting to tunnel through 50 feet of dense, compacted Virginia clay and rock with tools that wouldn't even cut it in a kindergarten sandbox. They used the same dull, rusted pocket knife, a few half-broken clamshells they scavenged from their meager food rations, and a crude wooden chisel. That was it. That was their entire excavation arsenal. Every single night, the team slipped down into the horrors of rat hell in small shifts to avoid suspicion. Once in the foul basement, they would crawl through the breach in the foundation wall and confront the brutal reality of the tunnel. This wasn't a spacious, reinforced mine shaft. This was a claustrophobic death trap. The tunnel was agonizingly small, only about 18 inches in diameter. It was barely wide enough for a grown man's shoulders to squeeze through. To dig, an officer had to lay flat on his stomach, wriggling headfirst into the pitch-black hole like a worm. There was no room to bend their knees or fully extend their arms. They had to claw at the dense earth in front of them with the clamshells, scraping the dirt back past their bodies with their bloody, blistered hands. The sheer physical exhaustion was crushing, but the psychological terror of the tunnel was what really broke men. It was absolute, suffocating claustrophobia. The further they dug, the less oxygen there was. The air grew impossibly thin, thick with the smell of damp soil and the putrid stench wafting in from rat hell. The men lying in the hole would violently gasp for air, their lungs burning, their heads pounding with intense migraines. They could only dig for a few agonizing minutes before they started to pass out. When a man hit his breaking point, he would weakly kick his feet, signaling the man behind him to grab his ankles and physically drag him out of the hole backwards, coughing and gasping for breath. And then there was the problem of the dirt. You can't dig a 50-foot tunnel without displacing a massive amount of earth, and they had absolutely nowhere to put it. If the guards found a pile of fresh dirt, the gig was up. So, the crew got creative. They stole a few wooden spittoons from the prison quarters, tied ropes to them, and used them as makeshift dump trucks. The man at the face of the tunnel would fill the spittoon with dirt, and another man in rat hell would drag it out. They carefully spread the fresh dirt over the basement floor, kicking an even layer of rotting straw, garbage, and dead rats over it to camouflage the evidence. It was an incredibly slow, tedious, and exhausting cycle. Dig, scrape, haul, hide, repeat. Every inch they gained was paid for in blood, sweat, and absolute terror. And the terror wasn't just inside the hole, it was above it. The tunnel was running directly underneath Carey Street, a heavily trafficked road right outside the prison walls. As the men dug, they were so close to the surface that they could hear the terrifyingly clear sounds of the world above. They could hear the heavy rumble of Confederate supply wagons rolling over the cobblestones. They could hear the sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the sentries' boots pacing directly over their heads. They could hear the guards talking, coughing, and even spitting on the ground, just inches above them. The tension was heart-pounding. If an officer in the tunnel coughed loudly, or if he scraped a rock too hard with his chisel, the guards above would hear it. The men in the hole had to hold their breath every time a wagon passed over, praying to God that the massive weight wouldn't collapse the thin ceiling of earth right on top of them. And the near misses were absolutely terrifying. On one horrifying night, as an officer was frantically clawing at the dirt, he hit a soft patch of earth. Without warning, a massive section of the tunnel roof completely caved in. Hundreds of pounds of heavy, suffocating clay crashed down, burying the man alive in the pitch-black 18-inch hole. Panic erupted. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The men behind him frantically grabbed his ankles and pulled with everything they had, literally dragging him out from under the collapsed earth mere seconds before he suffocated. They had to spend the rest of the night silently, desperately packing the loose dirt back into the ceiling, praying the street above wouldn't cave in and expose them to the guards. They were working against impossible odds, fighting against time, exhaustion, and the very earth itself. Their hands were raw, bleeding stumps. Their bodies were starved and emaciated. They were breathing toxic air and living in constant, agonizing fear of discovery or a horrifying death by suffocation. But night after night, the 15 men crawled back into the black void, dragging their spittoons, clutching their clamshells, and clawing blindly toward freedom. They were literally digging their way out of hell, one agonizing handful of dirt at a time. By early February 1864, the digging crew was running on pure adrenaline and desperation. For more than 2 grueling weeks, they had clawed their way through the pitch-black earth. Based on Colonel Rose's mental calculations, the tunnel stretched approximately 50 feet. It was an incredible feat of blind engineering, accomplished by starving men with pocket knives. Rose believed they had finally cleared the width of Carey Street and reached the lot on the other side, specifically aiming for a tall, wooden fence that surrounded a vacant carriage shed. If he calculated correctly, the fence would completely block their exit hole from the view of the sentries pacing outside the prison walls. It was time for the breakthrough, the defining moment of the entire operation. Rose, gasping for breath in the impossibly tight, airless tunnel, took the point position. He slowly aimed his crude chisel upward and began frantically scraping at the ceiling. The dirt fell into his eyes and mouth, suffocating him, but he kept digging. The soil grew looser. The air began to change. And then, his chisel punched through into the cold night air. But the thrill of victory was instantly crushed by a wave of sheer, unadulterated terror. As Rose pushed his hand through the small hole to feel the surrounding area, he realized something was horribly wrong. He didn't feel the rough wood of a carriage shed. He felt the hard, unforgiving surface of cobblestones. He hadn't hit the shed. His calculations were off. He had punched a hole straight up into the middle of Carey Street. Before the panic could fully set in, he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots. A Confederate sentry was walking directly toward the hole. Rose was paralyzed. He was trapped headfirst in a dirt tube, staring up at a small silver hole of moonlight. Through that hole, he could clearly see the soles of the guards' boots hitting the pavement, completely illuminated by the street lamps. The guard was so close that Rose could hear him breathing. If the sentry looked down, if he stumbled on the loose cobblestones, or if he just happened to shine his lantern toward the ground, he would be staring directly into the terrified, dirt-streaked face of a Union colonel. It was a terrifying what-if moment that made Rose's blood run completely cold. Holding his breath until his lungs screamed, Rose waited in frozen agony as the heavy boots crunched past the hole, missing it by mere inches. As soon as the footsteps faded into the distance, Rose frantically yanked his hand back, grabbed clumps of the clay he had just dug out, and desperately shoved it back up into the ceiling. He packed the dirt as tightly as he could, plugging the catastrophic mistake before the guard made his return lap. He had just dodged a bullet by an absolute hair's breadth. Crawling backwards out of the tunnel, covered in cold sweat and shaking violently, Rose realized they had to push further. They couldn't stop. The next night, the crew relentlessly dug another few feet, pushing past the street and deeper into the lot. Finally, on February 8, 1864, Rose went to the face of the tunnel again. He chiseled upward, breaking through the frosty earth. This time, his hand hit something solid but yielding. It was the wooden planks of the carriage shed wall. He had done it. He pulled away enough dirt to create a small, dark opening, peering out into the silent, heavily shadowed yard. They were completely hidden from the street. They had successfully bypassed the deadline, the armed sentries, and the impenetrable walls of Libby Prison. The impossible tunnel was complete. Rose carefully pulled a large flat rock over the exit hole to conceal it from the outside, then crawled back through the 50 feet of claustrophobic darkness to deliver the incredible news to his crew. The breakout was scheduled for the very next night, February 9th. But as the clock ticked down, a new, massive threat began to form inside the prison. The secret of the tunnel was starting to crack. You can't have 15 men secretly disappearing every night, coming back absolutely covered in mud, soot, and smelling of dead rats without other inmates noticing. Whispers began to echo through the crowded, freezing cell blocks. Men started noticing the quiet conversations, the nervous glances, the suppressed excitement among Rose's crew. Desperation breeds sharp eyes, and the starving prisoners knew something was up. By the late afternoon of February 9th, the tension inside Libby Prison was a ticking time bomb. The rumor mill was completely out of control. Hundreds of inmates now knew about the Rat Hell Tunnel, even if they didn't know exactly where it was. Rose and Hamilton were terrified. If the entire prison rushed the kitchen fireplace at once, it would create an absolute bloodbath. A riot would break out. The Confederate guards would hear the screaming, storm the building, and indiscriminately slaughter everyone involved. The entire operation, weeks of agonizing, life-threatening work, was literally hanging by a thread. As the sun began to set over the icy James River, casting long, dark shadows over the brick fortress, the atmosphere inside Libby was electric, with suppressed panic and wild hope. The leaders of the digging crew frantically moved through the cell blocks, grabbing men by the collars, furiously whispering threats, demanding order and silence. They set up a strict, heavily guarded queue at the kitchen door. Only one man was allowed to approach the fireplace at a time. No rushing, no pushing, no talking. The stage was set for the largest, most dangerous prison break of the Civil War. The hole was open. The street outside was swarming with armed guards, and deep down in the terrifying darkness of Rat Hell, the rats were waiting. It was time to go. The night of February 9th, 1864, was bone-chillingly cold. A thick, icy fog rolled off the James River, perfectly cloaking the heavily fortified streets of Richmond in a ghostly gray shroud. Inside Libby Prison, the air was thick with a terrifying mix of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated dread. The breakout was on. Colonel Rose and Major Hamilton had meticulously organized the escapees into small, tightly controlled groups. One by one, moving like silent phantoms, the emaciated officers slipped into the kitchen. The only sound was the low, rhythmic pacing of the Confederate sentries right outside the barred windows. Approaching the fireplace, each man silently removed the loose bricks, stared down into the terrifying, black void, and slid feet first into Rat Hell. The basement was worse than they had imagined. The smell of raw sewage and death instantly hit their throats, making them gag. The darkness was absolute. But the true horror was the noise, the frantic, aggressive squealing of thousands of starving rats violently agitated by the sudden influx of humans. Men had to bite their own hands to stop from screaming, as the massive rodents ran across their boots, bit at their ankles, and scrambled over the piles of rotting garbage. Guided only by the hushed, desperate whispers of the men ahead of them, the prisoners waded through the freezing muck until they found the breach in the foundation wall. And then they had to face the tunnel. For a man who has been starving and freezing for months, staring into an 18-inch hole of pitch-black dirt is a psychological nightmare. You have to lie flat on your stomach, plunge your arms forward into the suffocating darkness, and drag yourself through 50 feet of wet, heavy clay. The claustrophobia was paralyzing. Men hyperventilated as the walls closed in on them. The wet earth clung to their tattered clothes, pulling them down, burying them alive. The air in the tunnel was so incredibly thin and toxic that every desperate gasp felt like inhaling fire. The sheer terror of the crawl was amplified 1,000 times by the terrifying sounds from above. As they wriggled like worms under Carey Street, they could hear the heavy boots of the Confederate sentries pounding the cobblestones just inches above their heads. The sound was deafening. Every time a guard walked past, the men in the tunnel froze in absolute terror, holding their breath in the suffocating darkness, praying the roof wouldn't cave in and crush their skulls. It took an agonizing, lung-burning 5 minutes for each man to drag himself through the 50-foot nightmare. When they finally reached the end, they pushed past the flat rock concealing the exit and emerged, gasping, shaking, and covered head to toe in foul-smelling mud, into the freezing night air of the vacant carriage shed. But the nightmare was far from over. Getting out of the tunnel was only the first impossible step. They were now standing right in the middle of Richmond, the heavily guarded capital of the Confederacy. They were surrounded by enemy troops, military police, and hostile civilians. This is where the psychological game of the Breakout reached its absolute peak. To survive, they couldn't run. If a guard saw a filthy, ragged man sprinting down the street in the middle of the night, they would be shot in the back instantly. They had to walk. They had to step out of the shadows of the carriage shed, right onto the gas-lit sidewalks of Richmond, and casually stroll past the very men who were guarding their prison. It was a terrifying performance of pure nerve. Men stepped out in pairs, their hearts pounding against their ribs like hammers. They pulled their hats down low to hide their faces and casually walked down the cobblestone streets, desperately trying not to limp or shiver. They passed directly under street lamps. They walked within 10 feet of Confederate patrols. Some even boldly nodded, "Good evening," to the sentries as they passed, utilizing every ounce of their remaining sanity to act like ordinary citizens taking a midnight stroll. It was a masterclass in deception, and miraculously, it was working. The guards, completely oblivious to the massive hole in the ground just yards away from them, suspected absolutely nothing. But back inside Libby Prison, the strict discipline was rapidly, violently unraveling. As more and more men successfully disappeared into the fireplace, word spread like wildfire through the freezing cell blocks. The desperate, starving inmates who weren't in on the initial plan realized what was happening. Panic, raw and animalistic, took over. A chaotic, silent stampede erupted. Hundreds of desperate men rushed the kitchen in the pitch black. They fought, clawed, and silently beat each other in a frantic scramble to get to the fireplace. The leaders of the digging crew tried desperately to maintain order, throwing punches in the dark, violently whispering threats. But it was useless. The mob was out of control. Men were diving headfirst into rat hell, landing on top of each other in the putrid water, crushing the rats beneath them. The tunnel entrance was suddenly jammed with terrified men, violently fighting to squeeze into the impossibly tight hole. The noise was terrifyingly loud. The frantic splashing in the basement, the muffled cursing, the sound of bodies hitting the floor. It was a miracle the guards outside didn't hear the chaos. By 4 a.m., the situation inside the prison was completely unsustainable. The riot in the kitchen was on the verge of spilling out into the main corridors. The leaders of the escape realized that if they didn't shut it down immediately, the guards would hear the mob, storm the building, and discover the tunnel before the escapees had enough time to clear the city limits. With heavy hearts, the men who had stayed behind made the brutal decision. They physically fought the desperate mob away from the fireplace, grabbed the bricks, and furiously began sealing the hole back up. They plastered it with soot and ash, burying the entrance to rat hell once again. As the first faint light of dawn began to creep over the frozen James River, the chaos inside Libby Prison finally subsided. The remaining prisoners silently slinked back to their cells, their bodies shaking with cold and adrenaline. When the sun finally rose on February 10th, 1864, the impossible had been achieved. 109 Union officers had successfully crawled through the earth, walked past the guards, and vanished into the fog. But the real nightmare was just beginning, because when the guards realized what had happened, all hell was going to break loose. The morning of February 10th, 1864, began exactly like the hundreds of brutal mornings before it. The freezing wind rattled the iron bars of Libby Prison as the Confederate guards bellowed for the 5 a.m. roll call. The starving inmates stumbled out of their blankets, forming uneven, shivering ranks on the slick floorboards. Major Thomas P. Turner, the ruthless commandant, watched with cold indifference. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. His fortress was secure. But as the guards began shouting names and counting heads, a chilling realization started to creep over the cell blocks. The math wasn't adding up. The prisoners who had stayed behind were executing a desperate, high-stakes game of musical chairs. When a guard counted a row and turned his back, a prisoner would frantically duck down, sprint to another row, and get counted a second time to cover for the missing men. It was a chaotic, incredibly dangerous bluff. For a few tense minutes, it actually worked. But you cannot hide the absence of over 100 men in a heavily monitored room. A sharp-eyed guard suddenly stopped. He looked at the massive glaring gaps in the formation. He called out a name. No answer. Another name. Silence. The guard frantically recounted the block. Then, pure panic hit him. He sprinted to Major Turner. When Turner heard the news, his face turned ash gray. He immediately ordered a full, aggressive lockdown. Guards violently shoved the prisoners back into their cells, their rifles leveled, bayonets fixed. A vicious, meticulous recount was conducted. The final number hit Turner like a physical blow. 109 high-ranking Union officers had completely vanished into thin air. Turner was absolutely furious. It was a massive, catastrophic failure of security that would undoubtedly humiliate him in front of the entire Confederate High Command. He furiously tore the prison apart, demanding to know how they got out. His heavily armed search teams checked the barred windows, the heavy iron doors, the roof. Everything was secure. The building was completely sealed. It was as if ghosts had simply walked through the brick walls. But a desperate search of the ground floor eventually led them to the kitchen, A guard noticed the subtle disruption in the soot around the massive fireplace. He kicked at the bricks. They collapsed inward, revealing the terrifying black void leading down to rat hell. When the Confederate search party finally dropped down into the putrid basement, gagging on the smell of death and swatting away the screaming rats, they found the breach in the foundation. They shined their lanterns into the terrifyingly small 18-inch hole of raw clay. The realization of what the Union officers had done hit them with a wave of absolute shock. The Yankees had literally dug their way under the very boots of the Confederate sentries. The alarm was instantly raised across the entire city of Richmond. Cannons fired warning shots, echoing across the frozen James River. The telegraph wires lit up. The most massive, aggressive, and brutal manhunt in the history of the American Civil War was officially on. Turner unleashed hell. He immediately dispatched heavily armed units of Confederate cavalry, local civilian militia, and incredibly dangerous packs of bloodhounds. The hounds were specifically trained to hunt down escaped slaves and prisoners, and they were utterly relentless. The orders were crystal clear: track the Yankees down, dead or alive. The scene dramatically shifts from the dark, claustrophobic tunnel to the vast, terrifying wilderness of Virginia in the dead of winter. The 109 escapees were no longer dodging guards in a city. They were fighting for their lives against the brutal elements and an enraged enemy. They were scattered across the frozen, treacherous landscape in small, desperate groups. They had no food, no maps, no weapons, and absolutely zero cold weather gear. Their clothes were still soaking wet from the mud of the tunnel. To make matters worse, the closest Union lines were at Fort Monroe and Williamsburg, dozens of agonizing miles away, through dense, unforgiving swamps, freezing rivers, and heavily patrolled enemy territory. The physical toll was immediate and devastating. Men who were already severely weakened by months of starvation and disease in Libby Prison were now forced to sprint through icy bogs and hack their way through dense briar patches. Their boots fell apart, forcing them to run barefoot over jagged ice and freezing mud. Their feet turned blue, black, and numb with extreme frostbite. They had to hide during the daylight, burying themselves in rotting logs, freezing mud, or beneath the freezing water of the swamps, breathing only through hollow reeds while Confederate cavalry patrols galloped mere feet away. At night, they ran, completely blinded by the freezing rain, guided only by the faint, shimmering light of the North Star. But the most terrifying element of the chase wasn't the cold or the cavalry. It was the sound of the dogs. Deep in the freezing woods, the escapees would suddenly freeze, their blood running completely cold. From miles away, carried on the icy wind, came the low, mournful, terrifying howl of a tracking hound. Then another, and another. The hounds had caught their scent. The panic was absolute. The men forced their broken, exhausted bodies to run faster, desperately plunging into freezing rivers to try and break their scent trails. But the hounds were relentless. The chilling sound of the dogs baying grew louder and louder, echoing through the bare winter trees, rapidly closing the distance. It was the sound of impending death. The manhunt was a brutal, incredibly violent affair. When the hounds and the cavalry finally caught up to an exhausted group of escapees, there was no mercy. Men were savagely attacked by the dogs, violently beaten with rifle butts, chained together, and dragged forcefully back to Richmond. The dream of freedom was brutally crushed under the hooves of Confederate horses. The chase dragged on for days. The Virginia wilderness became a frozen, terrifying battleground of survival. The feds were closing the net tight, The dogs were howling in the fog, and the freezing men were running completely out of time. The terrifying question remained: would any of them actually survive the hunt? The Virginia wilderness in February is utterly unforgiving. It is a landscape of jagged ice, deep, freezing bogs, and a biting wind that cuts straight through to the bone. For the 109 starving men fleeing the horrors of Libby Prison, it was a desperate, chaotic fight against impossible odds. The Confederate dragnet was incredibly tight, and the Hounds were absolutely relentless. The brutal reality of the manhunt quickly set in. Over the course of several agonizing days, 48 of the escapees were violently hunted down. Exhausted, freezing, and physically broken, they were cornered in swamps, flushed out of barns by local militia, or dragged screaming from the brush by the bloodhounds. They were brutally beaten, chained, and marched all the way back to the nightmare of Libby Prison, where Major Turner threw them into solitary confinement holes so small they couldn't even sit down. 2 other officers never made it back at all. Their emaciated bodies were found floating lifelessly in the freezing currents of the James River, victims of exhaustion and the bitter cold. Even the mastermind himself couldn't outrun the feds. Colonel Thomas E. Rose, the man who had orchestrated the entire impossible operation, fought like a demon to reach the Union lines. He evaded patrols, survived the freezing temperatures, and actually made it within a few agonizingly short miles of safety. But he was physically destroyed. Starving and delirious, he was finally ambushed by a Confederate picket line, violently apprehended, and dragged back to the very cell block he had risked everything to escape. Miraculously, Rose would survive the war, later being exchanged for a Confederate officer, but his capture was a devastating psychological blow to the men who heard the news. But the rebel dragnet, no matter how massive and aggressive, couldn't catch everyone. Deep in the freezing swamps, a terrifying game of endurance was playing out. The remaining escapees pushed their bodies far beyond the absolute limits of human survival. They ate raw bark from trees. They drank freezing swamp water. They crawled on their hands and knees when their frostbitten, bleeding feet could no longer support their weight. And then, after days of unadulterated hell, a small group of ragged, starving men staggered through the dense tree line and collapsed onto a dirt road. They were so physically deteriorated, they looked like walking corpses. Through their delirious, blurred vision, they saw men on horseback approaching. The escapees braced for the inevitable crack of a Confederate rifle, preparing to die in the mud. But as the horses drew closer, the freezing men saw a color that made them openly weep. Blue. It was a heavily armed Union cavalry patrol out of Williamsburg. The soldiers stared in absolute shock at the filthy, bleeding, emaciated skeletons staggering out of the woods. When the men managed to choke out their names and ranks, the realization hit the Union lines like a thunderbolt. The impossible had happened. Over the next few days, small, desperate groups of men continued to stagger out of the frozen swamps, collapsing into the arms of the Union pickets. In total, 59 men successfully breached the Confederate lines. 59 men who had survived starvation, the suffocating terror of rat hell, a 50-foot crawl through an 18-inch dirt tube, and a massive, brutal manhunt through the freezing wilderness. It was a staggering, absolute triumph of human willpower. The Libby prison escape instantly became the single largest and most successful prison break in the entire history of the American Civil War. The news of the breakout completely humiliated the Confederate High Command and sent massive shockwaves through the Northern press. instantly turning the 59 survivors into legendary heroes. The incredible story of Colonel Rose, Major Hamilton, and the desperate men who clawed their way out of hell with pocket knives and clamshells stands as a terrifying testament to human desperation. They didn't have high-tech gear. They didn't have inside help. They had absolutely nothing but the crushing fear of death and the terrifying resolve to survive. The brick walls of Libby Prison were eventually torn down years after the war, the dark bricks shipped away to be used in other buildings, perhaps carrying the horrific echoes of the past with them. The site where the massive prison once stood is now just an ordinary paved lot in modern-day Richmond. But if you stand there on a freezing, quiet night, when the fog rolls heavy off the James River, you might just feel the icy chill of history. You might just imagine the desperate, muffled sound of scratching in the dirt, the terrifying scurry of rats in the pitch black, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of a sentry's boots on the cobblestones above. Because while the prison is gone, the psychological horror of what happened there and the impossible sheer will it took to escape it will never truly be buried. If you made it this far into the dark, frozen heart of rat hell, thank you for listening. Do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below letting me know which part of this impossible escape gave you the worst chills. I'll see you in the next one, but until then, stay out of the dark.